The 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide had a really cool section in it that taught us all about how to make a monster. It was exactly what a third-party creator needed to create something that felt like an official monster and reflected the same kind of quality you could see in D&D books. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was really close. So what do we get in 2024? Do we get those adjustments that show us exactly how to make a D&D monster? No. This book is great, but it does not have such a section. And if you look at the monster manual, it's not in here either. Nothing tells us how to make a 2024 monster until now. Yeah, I've gone and spent a lot of time creating the process you can follow for making a monster for the 2024 version of Dungeons and Dragons. Let's jump into it. So if you've been looking at this lovely book, the Monster Manual has a number of improvements. And I don't love everything about it. If you've seen my other videos where I do a review of the Monster Manual for 2024, or if you look at my blog, there are things like the lack of lore that really, really trouble me, really fall short, in my opinion, when you compare this book to its previous book, the 2014 Monster Manual. Look at me switching hands. So the thing about the 2024 Monster Manual, though, is it really does try to fix some problems there were with the underlying approach that Wizards used to reflect their desired monster math. They had a goal for the monster math, and then they would do things like say, well, this thing has some resistances, or when it hits, it does this thing, and so therefore I'm going to lower its damage to compensate for it. And what often happened is the monsters just weren't threatening enough. Unless they were dragons, they felt like they just were lackluster, especially at the highest CRs. Low CRs, it's actually the opposite. They could really harm your party really easily. Creators actually found that using the 2014 guidelines in the DMG could create better results, like more challenging monsters, than what Wizards of the Coast was doing in their official books. That was super interesting. So it actually meant the table was pretty useful. The outcome was really useful. It was something in the Wizards process. Well, the 2024 Monster Manual goes and fixes that. Their approach is a lot better for creating really cool monsters. And if it's a legendary monster, they give it an extra boost, and they have a lot of AoE in it that can be, as I discussed in my previous videos, super strong. So we end up with some really challenging monsters, and we say, okay, great, I want to make new monsters that fit that standard. What do I do? But there is nothing in the Monster Manual or in the DMG that really helps us create that. If you look at my previous video where I talk about things that the DMG tells us to create, it does have a sort of here's how to make a monster, but it's really how to tweak a monster by just adjusting little bits. And it doesn't tell us anything about CR, and certainly doesn't help us make anything for publication that might be something to the standards of what Wizards of the Coast creates. So I have gone through, I've analyzed the math of the Monster Manual. I have looked at the old process very, very carefully and compared that to the new standards to create what we would need to replicate what 2014 gave us in the DMG. A table we can shoot for and a process we can follow to create great monsters. So let's go through that process, and you can also find this at alphastream.org. So if you look at the 2014 DMG, you find this section on creating a monster, and it's pretty neat. It walks through kind of what you would need to see like, okay, I want to modify a monster. There's an easy way to do it. I want to create quicker stats, and so I just want to sort of like grab something from a table, and I can follow this table, which is a really neat table that gives us all of its offensive and defensive stats by CR. And then it says like, okay, you can do this kind of quick process to quickly make a monster, and you get its XP and all that. Or you can just go, let's go whole cloth, start to finish, and make a monster. And it walks us through a whole process. And what I've done is take this process and expand on it at my blog, alphastream.org. And in this video, I'm going to review this process as well to kind of walk you through it if this is more helpful in video format. And I'm going to look at the two ways to create a monster, because I think that it is helpful to have a quick method. And there are three different ways that I would suggest going about this. One is what we provide in the Forge of Foes book. In Forge of Foes, we really set out to say, okay, I've got a monster that I want to create. I can just go through a very quick process that creates an awesome monster using the table in Forge of Foes. You could also use the table that's in this blog. We can take neat things to add on, like monster powers and features that can flesh it out. You can also even start from ready to go stat blocks at various CRs and just use those and modify them. And I love that approach. So if you have Forge of Foes, you've got a great building a quick monster section right at the front of the book. It gives you a lot to go off of. Second way that you can quickly create a monster is then use the monster statistics by CR table that I'm going to show you in a second to just run that monster off of that and improvise, right? The table tells you what the AC should be, what the damage should be, and you can just improvise, right? You could have that on your DM screen and then just run with that and ad lib if you are happy to improvise. The more you like improvising, the easier that will be. And as you get good at it, you can do things like add monster powers like we provide in Forge of Foes, or have your own little bits that you'd like to add to represent the nature of that creature. In Forge of Foes, we give you things like powers that represent the role of the monster, right? So it's supposed to tank up and stop, the characters from getting past it. Well, then you can do things for that. That's really neat. But just using that table alone can be a really quick go-to. Oh, there are 3 guards. They are CR2, and here's what they look like. And you're just ready to go with that table. So if you feel comfortable, an excellent option. And the third is a slightly more complex process than using the table that I recommend in this blog. And it goes as follows. The first thing we do is we choose an existing monster that we're going to use. So maybe I'm trying to think like, okay, I want to have some sort of a weird alien, otherworldly, far realms creature that's going to come out and attack the characters. Maybe it's going to drip out of the ceiling and land on them, sort of like a green slime type thing. And so I go, okay, great. I want to build that. And it's always good to start with the CR. So I think, okay, it's going to be like a CR4 monster. So I can look up my oozes, see what there is in the monster manual, and pick an ooze that has as close as possible a CR. And that becomes our template creature. Then we can look at that template creature we chose and say, what do I not like that is already in the stat block, right? So I can take out things like maybe it has like a gelatinous thing, of being invisible. We're like, this isn't going to be invisible, so I'm going to remove that. But it's a really useful thing that I just removed. So we keep track that we kind of like in our credit, we have like +1 thing we could add back in because we took something out, right? And if I see another trait that I go, I don't want that, then we could take that off. Now we can go and add features to make up for the ones that we removed. So we could say, instead of being invisible like the gelatinous cube, I want it to split like one of those other oozes that when you hit it, it becomes 2. I like that idea. So we go and look up the wording of that, kind of if you're just working on this in a Word document or something, you just copy and paste those features in there. So maybe we add 2 more cool features to our ooze that we're creating, and we're borrowing from a lower CR ooze. Doesn't matter. We just take that language in, throw it in there so we know what it looks like. We've got rid of 2 features. We added 2 features, so we're pretty similar. The only thing that's off is our statistics are going to be off right now. So that's where we take our monster by CR table that I'm going to show you in a bit. And we look at that and we say, okay, I'm going to take these various, what I've got, this hodgepodge, this mishmash of the monster that I chose that was as close to my desired CR as possible, and these other features I added from maybe a lower CR creature, and I'm going to bump them all to be the correct CR. So I look at this monster by CR table, and I can pick out what those actual numbers should now be, what the attack bonus should be, the total damage in a round, and I can work that all out to bring that monster back up to what it should be. Or lower it if I went with something from a higher CR, right? We can then also do some things concept-wise. Like we could say, actually, I think this thing should be pretty hard to hit because it's all blubbery. Like you hit it and your weapon bounces off of it. So I'm actually going to give it a higher AC and I'm going to reduce its hit points. So you could go 2 up on the AC table, 2 down on the hit point table, if that makes sense, or an equal number of rows up and down. And that will generally balance your monster. You can then, once you're done, change it up however you want it. This is probably something you're doing for home play since you're using this quick process. So that's where we can say, I'm going to adapt and change this up. I know my characters are super strong, so I'm going to add this thing. Or I know that the rogue needs a challenge, or a reward mechanism. So I'm going to say that sneak attack double damage against it. Whatever it is. Your players, you can fool around and do whatever is most fun at the table, because this is not for publication when you're doing a quick monster this way. Once you've got it all ready, you can look at it. If you want, you can compare it to other monsters. Something I do when I'm creating things on the fly, or in a very quick method, is I think through, hey, if this design doesn't work, how can I change it on the fly? Right? So if this is too easy to kill, but this is supposed to be a threat that's around, maybe from when it splits to a certain size, 2 of them show up, or 2 more drip from the ceiling, or something like that. Maybe a quarter hit point ones drip out of the ceiling. So I think through how I can stopgap it at my actual table if it doesn't play well. And conversely, if it's too strong, maybe I do things like it'll only split so many times, right? So I can stop splitting it up and actually just kill off pieces of it, so that if it's too hard, they have a way out of it. So I think through that, because again, the point of this is fun at your table. Or maybe if you love that your players will just react to a monster that's too strong and your players know how to do that, then you can leave it being too strong or too weak, and it'll just be what it's going to be, and that's fine too. All right, so that was the quick method. So let's take a look at the actual table. In this table, I have to give special thanks, as done before in my other monster videos, to Tom Dunn and Paul Hughes, who've done a ton of work to think through what the math of the game in 2024 is like. I have done that kind of analysis too. I took every single monster, put it into a spreadsheet, ran numbers, did comparisons, tweaked, found typos, fixed those, just on and on. A countless amount of work to build this table, and also use the brilliance of both Tom and Paul to try to improve this table. I also use the work of Forge of Foes, which myself, Scott Gray, and Mike Shea put together. So you'll find that. And what you can do is just click on this table, and you get to see all of, by CR on the left column, all of the statistics you can expect. And this is kind of replicating, making its own version of what we had in 2014, but updating the math for 2024. And there are a few notes and explanations of what this table is like. You'll notice some things that are kind of variations to try to cover all the complexities that are involved. First thing that happens is when you're looking at this actual monster manual book, there are cases where a given CR will just have 2 monsters, right? And sometimes there are 10. But you'll have a monster that'll be one of the monsters for the CR that will be a concept, super easy to hit because it's enormous. So its AC is way lower than you would expect for its CR. That throws off our math, right? So if you look at what Paul Hughes did on his blog, he snaps everything to a line, right? What is the best fit line that really captures what it's supposed to be? And that's a great thing to do. And you'll see in this sheet, you can see these numbers, or in this image, you can see that there are values in red. And that's where the average math of the monster manual does not reflect what this number is, right? It's either lower or higher, probably because there's just a weird concept in play of a monster kind of throwing it off, right? Or enough monsters that are different that the number doesn't work. So at 1/4 and 1/2 CRs, the AC kind of goes up and down when we wouldn't expect that. We expect that as your CR goes up, the numbers go up. And so I've done my best to kind of smooth that line or snap it to a line so that the numbers make sense. They don't just go up and down randomly. They try to give you something to shoot for. So that's why you see some numbers in red. I'm just letting you know, hey, actual monsters at CR don't quite produce this number, but this seems reasonable. Okay, it's a reasonable thing to shoot for. The other thing that I've done is to look at situations where the monster math is so far off that I had to sort of extrapolate further. It's not just about not going wildly up or down on, say, AC, but other cases where you just see that the monsters in their design are compensating for something in some other way, right? So let's say there's a monster that it will knock its targets prone, getting advantage. It may actually have a lower attack bonus. or a monster that has tons of defensive features and its hit points are really low. And Tom did a really nice analysis of this, sort of saying, what is the true statistic behind everything once you account for all of those different things? And I'm getting geeky here. But just so you know that I've tried to do my best of looking at this. But what it means is if you look at something like the Tarrasque down here at CR 30, it has 697 hit points. It's the only monster that exists. But that's the published. And if you look at this third column, pub HP range, that is the published range of hit points. There's only a single number because there's only one monster to look at, and it has 697 hit points. So that is the average for all published monsters, the average of 1. In Forge of Foes, we have a recommendation, right? And then we have Tom Dunn's numbers. That's these TD average and TD legendary for normal and legendary creatures. And here what Tom is doing is he's saying, when you think about all the defensive features that the Tarrasque has, or monsters at lower CRs, this may be considered to be up to like 1,000 hit points. So what do I think? I would go primarily off of this published average number. That's what I would shoot for, because you want to feel like published numbers. But Tom's point is a really good one. And so I wanted to add this here as a sort of reference point that you can look at, as well as the Forge of Foes guidance, which is based on the goal of being fun at the table. So you can take that into consideration. And what I would say is, when you make a monster, look at the other monsters that exist for it in 2024 for that CR and see whether what you're creating matches up, right? If you have a certain number of hit points, but you don't have any of the defensive creatures that the Tarrasque has, you may end up being too weak, right? So the Tarrasque is a combination of 697 hit points and like 3 different things that help it avoid trouble. So you should replicate that design or add more hit points or more AC, but that gets a little tricky. So what I've done is try to be in this published average hit point. I've tried to shoot for what you really will find in the book, but you've got to consider those factors. This also comes up when we talk about damage. The attack bonus is pretty straightforward. The number of attacks in multi-attack are pretty straightforward. But when you get to damage, again, there are some things to look at where it feels like the game is often compensating in different ways. The designers are doing sort of interesting things and telling us a story with the monster, and that makes it hard to know what number to use. I would use this average damage to round, which is my best estimate of what we're really shooting for to feel like published monsters. But again, look at your monster when you create it, compare it to others of the CR and go, well, look, is my monster just dealing damage and other monsters are dealing similar damage, but they have conditions they're imposing or neat auras that are going to do recurring damage in a way that I hadn't properly accounted for. Think about that, right? And modify your monster accordingly. These 2 columns, TD is Tom Dunn, average damage per round, and average legendary, because Tom looks at the fact that legendary monsters get a big boost. And that is important. If you're making a legendary monster, then I would switch from using my average, or at least temper my average that I provide with what these legendary columns are, because those may be more accurate for your legendary monster. But again, be careful, take a look at it. I'm not really sure that we want 1,007 hit points for a CR 30. I think that's high. So it's a thing to look at, compare to other monsters, and choose your best course forward. That may sound like, well, I'm going to end up inaccurate. Well, guess what? The monsters here are not accurate to some line on a CR table, right? There is an art to this. It is not just math, or let's say it's math, but involves sort of some interesting calculations behind the scene. And you can do that same thing just by simply comparing to those monsters that exist. Save DC is pretty straightforward, right? That is the DC that your party, the characters, will have to save against when it uses effects that have a saving throw. Initiative bonus, which is much more important in 2024. So I've listed that out in the table. It wasn't in the original 2014. It's just sort of like, whatever its initiative is, doesn't matter. But here we see monsters increasingly get proficiency or even expertise in initiative. So I would again look at this table and I would compare to the other monsters that are similar. If your monster is a boss, is a genius, is experienced in fighting, is super cunning, then that may call for an initiative bump. by either proficiency or expertise, look at similar monsters. And I've given you example monsters that I think are sort of representative. We did this in Forge of Foes as well. I think it's a neat approach, where you just kind of go like, okay, what is this CR? Oh yeah, that's the CR of a bear, or that's the CR of an Etten, right? It's helpful to think things like that and compare. And finally have your XP. So that's what you'll see in the table here that you can use both in the quick method and in the complex one. So now let's take a look at actually making a monster from scratch. So when we create a monster, I recommend first having your CR as your first step. This is helpful because it will balance all the steps against the target of the table and help you evaluate where you are. You may end up changing your mind on CR, and that's fine, but having at least a loose idea at the beginning is helpful. And you can think of it as a concept like this is as dangerous as an ogre, or it's as fantastically challenging as a solar. And then look up, well, what's the CR of that? And just start even loosely with those concepts, right? And work off of that. You could just work on statistics and find the CR later, but I find that that just leads to more work down the road. CR is often going to be a good thing to know because you're either building for a specific adventure or you want a certain type of challenge. And so that's where you might want to do something like if you're a patron member and you pull up the adventure, encounter, monster tools, you can look that up and like build a fake encounter and kind of like, okay, what kind of level characters am I threatening? If I have 5 PCs of level X, what CR works? That's the kind of threat I want, and that can be very helpful. Or you could use the encounter building rules that are in the DMG. But either way, starting with CR is a great first step. And then we want to think about the concepts and the basics. And you will probably already have some of this in your mind, but really writing it out. It's this kind of a challenge level, that's my CR. But here's the kind of monster, right? It is a giant and it's tied to nature in some way. It's a forest giant. Or maybe you've got a concept like this is something that's an elemental creature, but it has like a second element within it, right? Just whatever this concept is, think about it, visualize it, describe it in a paragraph. Maybe it's a combination undead and elemental. So you're thinking through how it channels that elemental energy, how that manifests, and the kind of things it might do. That kind of creative process of capturing that concept will pay off throughout the entire process. Here we can also select the monster type, right? Is it an elemental or is it undead? What is it most like? You have a full list of these in the monster manual and in the free rules. And you want to choose its size, right? The size is going to determine hit dice, which is one of the more complicated and annoying steps, is the combination of hit dice and constitution score to determine hit points. Because then you're going against the table. But if you're doing this officially for publication, it is something you have to wrestle. So start with your size, because that's easy. You know what it'll be. That's going to assign a die size to your hit points. If it's tiny, it's D4. If it's gargantuan, it's D20s. And you would choose that, even though this kind of doesn't matter for play, right? Hit points are hit points. You almost never healing as a monster. But it is just something that you have to do when you're writing for publication. If you have my adventure tools, there is a thing there they're a little part of the spreadsheet that will help you calculate your hit points off of your hit dice size and the number of hit dice that you decide. How many hit dice you assign is actually something you kind of get to pick. So it's up to you, but each of those hit dice will get the constitution bonus. So that's why you have sort of multiple moving pieces, and it'll take some practice to work through it. Look at example monsters to make sure you did it right. And work through that. Other touches that you can do at this stage are things like your alignment as part of your concept. And you can look at the Monster Manual for guidance. The 2024 is slightly different about how it looks at alignment. And notice that we don't see now the typically wording that was in the Monsters of the Multiverse book. So follow that 2024 standard for alignment. Also rare to see something like unaligned, which we saw a lot in 4th edition. Other touches include skill proficiency, so think through which skills they should have, senses like dark vision or even the ability to see, like blind sight, languages you speak. All of these things do not impact CR, even though some may feel like they should, and you could consider it that way, but they really do not impact CR in official design. So that's all kind of concept, and you can just write those down and then add them in later in the process once you start fleshing out that stat block. One of the most interesting things is ability scores. There is almost no guidance in the 2014 rules for how to do it. We know that ability ranges from 1 to 30, and they say, look at similar monsters and pick a score that you think it should have. So you can do that, right? You could say, well, this is as strong as an ogre, or it's as strong as a fire giant, and go look up what those are, and then make a decision. But of course, what ends up happening is these scores will have modifiers, right? 16 strength plus 3. That's going to affect, if you do the math of that particular way, your attack bonus and your damage and all of that. So they actually do matter a fair bit. You may also want to brush up on the meaning of ability scores, what they signify to the DM, and theoretically step removed to the players based on what they have, right? What does it mean to be highly intelligent but low wisdom? Or what does it mean to be, really high strength but low con? And if you read Keith Amon's The Monsters Know What They're Doing series of one of the other follow-up books he's done, those are awesome. They give you great ideas, the best I've seen, on what it means to have an ability score say something about the creature. So all of this to say that while the official rules don't show the importance of it, it is kind of important. It is a good idea to model it on other monsters, but think through the story of what you're saying, right? If you're designing something like a crab creature, really how strong is it? And there's some variance there as you think through that concept. And so you may want to think about, play around with it, set an initial set, and then as you're working on statistics, you may go back and change this. As I said before, Constitution, big impact because of your hit points and the math. The bonus is hard to calculate, so use a tool for that, write your own, or use the one that I provide to Patreon supporters. So now let's get into some more typical statistics. Your armor class can be derived in one of two ways. You can simply look it up in the table and use that. That's what the 2014 process tells us that's simply fine. And in 2024, we don't have a process other than the one I'm describing. So you can really just use the AC that you should have for the CR. It's CR 6, AC 16. But you can also adjust for your concept, right? I'm AC 16, sure, that's my CR average, but this is a creature made of stone, so I should be a higher AC. Or this creature is really big and easy to hit, or it's sluggish. I'm going to lower its AC a couple points. That's fine. Keep track when you deliberately do that. You can also calculate your armor class based on the armor the monster wears, its natural armor, or a spell like mage armor. 2024 seems to back off of this in some cases. Like 2014, it really feels like they tried to always reflect worn armor and natural bonus that someone thought was really like real and true, which is fascinating. You don't seem to have to do that as heavily as you once did, which further encourages you to just go with the table and make some additions. But it is fun that if this is a monster that's wearing plate mail, or it's a brigand that's wearing, leather armor or hide or something like that, well, then reflect that armor class that feels right. And think through whether they should be carrying a shield and therefore they only attack one-handed, right? That's an important thing to do if you're trying to strive for that verisimilitude, that kind of feeling of it really being a real creature that has gear. These two approaches, whether you use the table or whether you calculate it out, can leave you with a very different result. So think through when you do it one way or the other, is this going to create a fun monster, right? And does it reflect its nature? Is this a highly mobile creature that has a high dex bonus to it? And so we feel that in its armor class. Is it something that should be pretty easy to hit? Is it accomplished warrior that blocks attacks? And it may be that in some ways you can achieve that by doing something like saying, well, it's actually kind of easy to hit, but has the ability to dodge a blow when it needs to because of its cunning, not its AC, right? Or it's made of stone, so certain types of weapon don't hit it, although that's frowned upon in 2024 design more than it was before. But maybe it can block attacks, right? This is a skilled combatant, so it can block attacks. That kind of logical armor class versus features, right? Thinking through that will lead to better play and a better monster overall. The official rules really don't tell us how armor class impacts play, and that's a very important to think through. Very important part to think through. So when your monster is really hard to hit, that may feel like it's real, but it's frustrating, right? Yes, it reflects the fact that this creature is made of stone or has, glowing force fields around it or whatever. But, is that going to be fun? And so again, that may be where you want to lower that AC a bit to keep it in the fun range and give it some features that are defensive instead that reflect its nature, right? I've had really fun with things like a clockwork metal machine that as the party hits it, its armor class degrades and gets inside. And then I made them laugh by saying the inside was made of nougat. So that was just a joke. It wasn't really. But they laughed, when the third layer of its armor is beaten down, and it made the joke that it was nougat, but it wasn't. It was flesh. Or maybe it was wood. I don't remember. But thinking through that, right? Like, it can be fun to hit monsters. So maybe you want to do that and compensate in other ways. Think through that, and we have some neat advice in Forge of Foes on these kinds of topics. And let's go to hit points. As with armor class, there are the two ways you can calculate it. You can just take the line from the table, or you can derive the hit points based on the hit dice and the constitution score, which is almost always what you saw in 2014 monster design. I haven't backtracked the 2024 monster manual to see whether that's true or not, but it probably is. So generally, it's best to calculate it out. It will reflect your monster more in line with official characters. It'll feel more like official monsters. But you can go up or down the table to then capture your concept. So sort of shoot for a lower CR or higher CR if this is a thing that should just be a walking bag of hit points, right? This huge giant, so it should have a ton of hit points, even if its armor class is lower, right? That combination of hit points and hit dice, I walked through my blog on how you calculate it, and you've got the tool, but you want to work through that and think through how that creates the feel of your monster, right? That they hit it over and over again and deal damage to it. And the contrast of AC and hit points creates a lot of variance in play, right? Really hard to hit it, but low hit points, that can be a certain type of feel for a combat, versus really high hit points and a low AC, right? That is a different type of situation. You hit it all the time, but you've got to hit it over and over again. And that can be fun or not, depending on how far we go to the extremes and what else is going on in the battle. So think about those angles. Also important is adjustments to effective hit points. And this is something the 2014 DMG talked us through, because you can have things that really impact that are like hit points, right? In fact, it impacts the effective hit points you have. So if you're resistant to a lot of damage, then this can impact your design and how the monster plays. Essentially, you have hit points. If this is a creature that was resistant to all of the damage the party can make, it basically has doubled hit points, right? But if it's sometimes, then it's a factor, but not completely important. Or if they're playing at a level where they will be able to always get past what it's resistant to and choose something else to damage it with, then it's not even a factor at all, right? So the higher the CR of the monster, the less it matters. So that is all still true. And even more important are things like immunities, right? This can really make things when nobody can deal poison damage to it, and nobody can, usually characters and players are pretty used to that because they see that even at low levels. But the more that it's immune to fire or immune to cold or immune to lightning, that comes up more and more, especially if there are many of them. And so what you may want to do is say, well, because I have this, I'm going to lower 1 or 2 steps on my hit point table, give it fewer hit points, as if it were a lower CR creature. The importance is still there for resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities to tell a story. Vulnerabilities are very rare. Talked about it recently on the Mastering Dungeons podcast. You essentially don't want to use them, but the presence of them tells a story, right? We are saying that this thing is so hardened by having lived in a frost environment that it's resistant to cold or even immune. And it's important to draw attention to them if we're going to have them, right? Make it a big part of the concept. Have other things that reflect its nature so characters are tipped off to it, because the fun here will be finding this out, right? And so, if you think about like an iron golem in traditional play, when you realize it's impervious to most of the damage you're dealing, that is actually shocking and even fun when you then discover what you need to do to defeat it, right? So try to build so that there's this reward involved in it, and the players will feel rewarded for thinking through it. Like, I bet this thing's immune to fire because it's this, lava snake. Okay, cool. Smart move, and you feel good about it. And maybe you think cold might do extra damage. And that's where you can think about, instead of a vulnerability, something else that might happen. If you think of the troll, that when you deal fire to it, it can't regenerate, right? What if the lava snake has a really devastating attack? Like maybe it has a fire aura, right? That anybody near it is taking fire damage, but you deal cold damage to it and that fire aura goes away. That's a really neat, rewarding device that is a lot better than saying, oh, it's vulnerable to cold, and then they kill it really quickly because everybody can do Ray of Frost or whatever it is. This is a little more rewarding in terms of that play for both you and the party. Everybody feels good about it. Other features are worth looking at. In the blog, I give the example of the Tarrasque. Defensive features like a reflective carapace or whatever else might be that significantly impact its survivability. The only way to really assess these is just compare to existing ones. So if you're thinking about adding something, look at other such monsters, think about how that affected their CR, and adjust accordingly. But in general, a few features won't cause your monster to be outside of the guidelines of what you'll see here. Just again, pay attention to whether they're super strong. And last on this list, we get to attack bonuses. So here, the easiest thing to do is to use the table for the CR. That's generally what I would suggest. It's going to give a better result than just calculating it out. But you can calculate it based on the strength or dex. And it's almost worth reverse engineering it. Use the table, figure out what the strength or dex should be to validate that attack bonus. That's generally going to produce a better result, because you don't want to be wildly off just because of what your thought of the strength. Yes, this does mean sometimes, and this is very true, if you look at the 2024 Monster Manual, it is full of cases where you look at, I'm sorry, how strong is this creature? This thing is like a pretty average monster, and yet it has a statistic that's better than any human or almost all humans on the planet, right? It's really, but that is the way D&D is made in order to back up all these various values. So yes, it's easier to start with the table, even if it may produce a so high a number that you think, well, really, should it be that strong? But that may be the best way to do it. You could also go with a lower strength or dex and just say, hey, magic does this, or cunning and training does this, or whatever it is, right? And so they have a higher attack bonus for story reasons, and you just won't see that represented in the statistics. And that's okay too if you find that your ability scores would just be out of the expectation that you have for the monster, then that's fine. We don't get in 2014 any instructions or guidance on this. So just, this is my advice to you. Think about whether we're talking about a trained soldier that, has this bonus to attacks just because of its training. Also think through the idea of whether it makes sense to be inaccurate for the story. So a giant shark that has a single attack that is not the most accurate, but when it hits, does huge damage, like way more damage, let's say 3 rows higher on the CR table, can actually be really cool, right? Any big, enormous, dangerous creature like that can be a lot of fun. If you think about your T-Rex type monster, right? The idea that it's not super accurate, but when it gets you, oh yeah, that really hurts, right? Versus a trained soldier, makes sense that they'd be a lot more accurate and have multiple attacks because they're constantly like jabbing at you and attacking, right? That makes more sense story-wise. Let's get on to a super important one, which is damage. So damage is a tough one to backwards calculate. If you look at the table, you will find what is the average across 3 rounds. And that is actually how Wizards calculates their monsters. I verified with team members this is still the case. And when it involves area of effect, we're talking about it hitting 2 targets. Doesn't matter if it's a fireball spell or it's a cone that it breathes. Doesn't matter if it's a 120-foot emanation or it is a 15-foot cone. It is hitting 2 targets. Does that make sense? No, but that is what we do. So what you want to do is look at the table and figure out that damage that is expected. You could still decide to calculate damage based on the weapon it's wielding, the ability score, and you want to choose dice of damage that feel right and are sort of fun to roll, right? So, if this is a longsword, well, it could just be a D8, but do you want to maybe reflect the fact that this is a really accomplished fighter, and so it's 3d8 plus a bonus? Maybe. What you don't probably want to have is rolling 20d8, because you'll be asking everybody from nearby tables at a convention to lend you their d8s, or you'll be just rolling over and over and over again and having to math it out and count on your fingers how many times you've rolled. So keep it kind of fun and reasonable as you're building that profile. And damage will go hand in hand with your actions, which we're going to talk about next. But for damage, it's really important to look at that average across the 3 rounds and think through 3 rounds as being sort of math, but also understanding that your combat could easily be shorter or lower, right? This monster might be a goblin type creature that's going to get picked off really quickly, and it may just go 1 round, right? So can it do a fun thing in 1 round or 2? 3 rounds is a nice way to calculate the average damage it dishes out, but a lot of monsters will last longer as they, maybe can hide or are simply the less critical monster that people fire on, or maybe it's a support kind of monster, or maybe it's the boss that is strong enough to last longer than 3 rounds. So can it be effective longer than 3 rounds and fun longer than 3 rounds without being so cumbersome to prepare that you have all these things that would be great in a 10-round combat, but are just blowing your mind away with complexity when you're just going to end up with 3 to 5 rounds, right? So you don't want too many actions, and we'll talk about actions in a bit. But we take that 3 round of what we think, and it's actually kind of helpful, because what helps you do is say, okay, I have 3 rounds. What is my monster doing, right? Well, its bonus action does this. Its first round, it's going to do this thing. Then it's going to use an AoE spell. Then it's going to attack with its claws, and then it's going to take a bite. And that's the 3 rounds and worth of damage. And you average it out, calculate it. Something that only happens once, you multiply by 1/3. Something that does twice by 2/3. You add that all up and figure it out. What is this monster's average, and how does it reflect that table? And as you're building up those different actions, it's sort of like a pool of damage you can assign, and you want to not go over that total by too much, right? Not to where you end up in the next CR category. You can ignore actions that you're not going to use, is something we're told in 2014 logic. And that is still true, except in 2024, sort of trap actions are gone. And that's a good idea, right? So even if we think about imagine a T-Rex that had like a little hands attack. No, we don't need it, right? Like if the hands don't deal real damage, get rid of that and just focus on the bite. What we do want to do, however, is think about how monsters can deal ranged damage, and we want them to be effective at that. We don't want to create situations where your monsters or the DM's monsters show up and the characters just stay far away and win easily that way. So most monsters should have a ranged attack. Maybe the T-Rex can take a thing in its mouth and chuck that person, chuck a grab target at someone else, right? Figure out a way to make it work, if it at all should conceptually. Maybe you really say, my T-Rex cannot attack at range, and that's fine. Some monsters can't, but usually you want to come up with that. And so if you think about the types of actions that you create, and I'll just start getting into the action topic as well here, you can think about, all right, I need to be able to do melee. I need to be able to do ranged. Sometimes it's the same action. You can see in the monster manual versions that have that, it's a force bolt that can be either a melee or ranged. That's fine. You can create a stat like that, an action like that. But you want to cover those bases, and you want to think about whether there should be some AoE, because that's a nice way to create effective and tactical play. But we want it to represent the monster, right? If it's just a soldier, maybe they're throwing a alchemist fire or something, but does that really fit its nature? No, it doesn't. So unless it's part of the concept, then it shouldn't be there. Multi-attack is recommended as your CR climbs up, and you can look at the table to see where those recommendations come in, what the number is. The reason for multi-attack is to have it be more fun for the DM and have a more reasonable outcome that matches expectations. When you roll a d20, it can be anywhere from 1 to 20. The more dice you roll, the more you're likely to get middle average results over time. And thus, you are getting a bell curve of results. So your monster gets like what it should. So when you're attacking 3 times in a round, twice in a round, 4 times in a round, you are getting closer to that average probability. And that is helpful to create a more uniform experience and deliver on the promised damage that you think you should get. So that's why multi-attack is really useful. And it's a good thing to do, again, unless you have that concept that like this is the huge shark that is going to miss you a couple times and then it's going to get that one big bite in and just really blow everybody away with how much that hurt. That can be super fun. It's really easy when you're monster creating, if you're like me, to come up with lots and lots of cool ideas and you just want to narrow it down, right? 3 actions is great. 5 can work. You really don't want to go higher than that without really good reasons for it. Like this is a boss. Like you can take a look at something like the Lich and see how many actions it has. But in general, we want to keep our monsters easy to run when we're creating for publication. Find the best way to represent the flavor and story of the monster in as few actions as possible and to be effective with a small number of actions. Going back to damage for a second, it's a good question as to what you should do between having static damage in the attack or having damage dice that you roll, right? Like 4d8 plus 36 or 1d8 plus, whatever that average is. You can look at that, and if you've got my adventure tools, I give you all kinds of dice breakdowns, so you can look at that, but you can find those online as well. Those really help you think through the feel of it, and there's no real guidance on it. Best thing to do is to look at other similar monsters for the CR, and just what you think feels well based on your experience and play, so that you're not rolling so many dice. It's a lot easier to roll like 2 dice and add a static number. So think about that and how much payoff you're getting from reflecting things. But if it's something that makes super sense, like a fireball having the number of dice that a fireball does, then that can make more sense, right? So think for spells, it's generally better to really be the spell as much as possible. And I should say that spells in 2024 tend to be different than they were in 2014. Your spell lists are much shorter. We're not trying to replicate a spellcaster 100%. But your spells are spells usually, unless they are a concept like I'm doing force bolt, my fire bolt, or not even fireball, but something like, if I'm doing like fiery blast, right? Just you make up a thing that represents just shooting fire as a mage. That's fine. But if you're going to do an actual fire bolt spell, then that should be something that exists as a listing. That is not my favorite design, as I've said before. I think that looking up a lot of spells is a hindrance. But, think about how closely you want to be tied to the official paradigm, right? The current official paradigm is to use spell lists, have fewer spells in the spell list. You're not trying to replicate it's a level X cast. You're trying to just hit that challenge level. You could decide to do something that's maybe more friendly by having actions for spells. That there's a certain group of people who will really like that. But also there's some players who want the reality of having spell lists. So it's a give and take, and there's no perfect answer there. 2 last bits here. Initiative, as I said already, initiative is really important now because it's part of the changes in 2024 to reward monsters with a higher initiative bonus. Look at the table, go off of that, look at the different monsters and decide what your initiative should be. The more that this is a monster, the way I look at it is, imagine you run an encounter and you had 5 monsters and this is one of them. Would you be really sad if it rolled low? Like, do you want it to kind of get first? Should it story-wise be going first? Then it's worth thinking about proficiency bonus or even expertise. The more that it's a boss, the more that's true. So when it comes to DCs, this is interesting because I would normally want to say use the table, and you should look at the table to get ideas. But the DCs are really, in 2024, calculated. You will see this. A great example is like a dragon. Some of the dragons will have a spellcasting DC, and it'll see it's based on charisma or whatever its spellcasting ability score is. And it is calculated off of that. So you want to kind of do the math to have the right ability score to produce the result that's on the table for that DC. Make sense? with the whole 8 plus proficiency bonus plus ability score calculation. Some of those dragons then have a breath weapon that uses a different statistic like Constitution, because that's what felt real to the designers. And so the DC is actually slightly different between the breath weapon. Like it's actually, I think, higher for the breath weapon than it is for spellcasting because of that decision they've made in the design. You see it in almost no other creature. I think it's really just like a few of the dragons. But it's that idea, and you do see some escape DCs that are different, that are based on that, right? The escape DC, when something's grappling, will be based on their dex or strength. And so that's where you'll see that also could be different than spellcasting or other DCs they may have. So you want to reflect that variance. Look at some examples as you're designing, right? Think about if you're swallowing, or grappling, look at a couple monsters that grapple and use that technique. And think through that. But yeah, generally for your DCs, you want to work off of your ability scores, verify that you're hitting the expected range for your CR, and then modify it. And I'll just go ahead and say this now, but it should be important to know at all these steps, you can go some number of up or down on this table, or you could say my DCs are way higher on the table than my attacks. And that's how I'm modifying things. Like it doesn't hit very easily, but its DCs are higher, and that's compensating, right? And that's fine. Next, we want to think about the special traits, actions, and reactions that we have. And this is something that was really neat in 2014. We actually had a table that showed us a bunch of monster features and what we could do with them. So take a look at this cool table, right? It gave us example monsters, gave us the names of various traits and other features, and then it told us whether it impacted the challenge rating, right? So what does it mean to be aggressive like the orc or a doppelganger's ambusher treatment? And some of them didn't do anything, right? To be amorphous or amphibious didn't actually change the challenge rating at all. And this is still a table that's worth to keep handy and take a look at, because it can actually be something you use to modify. Now, keep in mind, 2024 probably has changed its way of viewing some of these. Some of these were a little too strong in terms of it weakened the monster too much to say that its CR was higher because of this, meaning they had to compensate for the design somewhere else, often by reducing the monster's damage. So, if the monster can enlarge itself and do a little more damage, that doesn't mean that you should then knock its damage down substantially, because now it's not even a feature, it's like a penalty, right? So you want to think through it, but it would be super cool if they had provided a table like this for 2024. They did not, but be aware this exists. It does give you a nice table of ideas that you can refer to, and think about whether that's something cool. You want to add any of these types of features to your monster. We don't have a 2024 version, and we should be careful because, again, you don't want to make your monster be weaker than it should be because it has cool features. So we may want to choose some of those features. If we add those features in, make that decision as to whether it should impact the CR. A lot of times it will not. Look at the 2024 monsters for comparison. Like if you've got a monster that pounces, well, in 2014, it did not affect significantly. And if you look at monsters now, I would say it has almost no effect. It's just a way that it does its damage. And so that's okay. You don't have to lower your effectiveness of your monster based on that. Also consider how these traits, actions, reactions, even bonus actions are creating that story of your monster, whether it's too much. Is it an actual boost to what the monster does that pays off, giving the complexity of running this for your DM, right? If you think about a monster that charges and does more damage when it charges, that can be fun tactics, but if you get too complicated, it wouldn't be fun, right? We wouldn't want a monster where if you start adjacent to 2 or more creatures and end adjacent to 2 or more other creatures, no, right? If you start next to a corpse, too much. Like just keep things so that they're fun and easy. Your monster's speed generally does not affect CR. The exception that we get into 2014 rules is a flying creature. They say that your effective AC is too higher because of the idea that it's actually hard to hit it. You may have melee characters who can't reach it. I think that really depends on a number of things, right? It depends on whether this monster is active at CRs where characters have fewer options. It also matters whether you think the encounter design really will lend itself to this creature being a flying creature. You know, a Scourge flies until it lands on a character, at which point it's drawing blood and you want to attack it. So does it super matter that it's flying? The truth is this thing's never trying to fly away from you or stay, you know, it's not lodging ranged attacks. It effectively isn't flying, right? In terms of adjusting its CR. Dragons could actually stay far away from you and just breathe every so many rounds, but they generally don't do that in a battle either unless you get really tricky with it. And that's more about encounter design. So I would be very cautious around flying creatures or any other kind of mode of transportation where you really think you should affect its CR. Look at comparable examples in 2024, but I don't know that it is a big deal as they made out before. I would say it is not. You probably in most cases, things that fly end up being accessible to the characters, unless the point is to make it more challenging, and that's an encounter decision, not a monster decision. Next up is the concept of saving throws. You can use saving throws based on their ability scores, and then decide whether they should have proficiency in them, an additional bonus based on that. We even have expertise in some cases. Use comparable monsters, look at that and think through it. You know, is this a creature that really should be particularly resistant? You can do so. In 2024, there seemed to be an effort to kind of go in and standardize monsters so that they're not always just better at like the most prevalent statistics. So there were certain stats that it was just really easy to target with spells and others it was very hard. They've kind of tried to even that out. And so it's worth trying to do on your end too, to not just reflect what you think are the most common saving throws made, but rather really what is the nature of this creature. Then we have the question of it being a legendary monster. As I described before on the table, you've got the average legendary hit points and the average damage per round for legendary. So you can use those when you're creating a legendary monster, but I don't know that they're perfect. Just think about them and compare to what's in the book. The most important part of being a legendary monster is that you're going to give it those legendary actions. You'll probably have some legendary resistances or similar defenses. The legendary actions should build up that damage that is a bit more than the typical monster. And that's why you see the legendary average damage per round is important to look at. You want to have that good threat that comes from it being legendary, in addition to the fact that having more options means more chances to create a solid result, right? It's that idea that if your boss had one single attack, probably someone in the party can find a way to counter it. But it can do things on other characters' turns or at the end of their turns, during its turns, reactions, bonuses. So think about how that all comes together. You probably want to have multi-attack that's pretty useful. You probably want to have either or both of bonus action and reaction, and you want to have these legendary actions. Usually legendary actions, you can do 3, 4 in layer, and you want to have at least 3 options, but 2 to 4 is typical for legendary actions. And many times you have one of them or 2 of them being a very like, this monster attacks, right? So whatever it's got in one of its multi-attack actions, it can do one of those, like a bite or a claw. And then it will have a more powerful option in the legendary actions that'll be something like it, teleports 3 times and everything that it was next to takes X damage, right? And then it'll use the text that says this creature, whatever the monster's name is, monster can't take this action again until the start of its next turn. And that keeps it to 1 per turn. So consider doing that. Give it something really cool and powerful that it can do. Usually you want to have something that's mobility based because you don't want bosses to get just pinned down, right? They're in the fiery pit of whatever that somebody summoned. You need to get things out of danger. It's pinned against the wall or whatever. Get it out of there and go somewhere else. And so look at the existing legendary monsters for those CRs and pick accordingly there. But that's a very important thing. You want more hit points, more damage than regular monsters, and then you want to have that mix of actions, including those legendary actions. So the last step in the process is to compare where you've ended up after you create all of these actions, all of your stats, where you are against your CR line. And the 2014 DMG has a process whereby you first start with your hit points and you say, hey, the hit points you gave your monster, what CR has those hit points? So you might say, okay, I have about 60 hit points or so that I've calculated for my monster. What does that mean? Well, that would say that I'm CR3, right? And then we want to look at the armor class. And whatever armor class you gave your monster, we will adjust that CR that we just got from the hit points up or down. For every 2 points of AC that is higher or lower than we expected for that CR matching our hit points, we alter the CR by 1 point, right? So if, for example, I have AC, let's see, CR3 would normally be AC 14, but if I have AC 16, which is 2 higher, then I could say that really my CR is more like 4, right? And that would be my defensive CR. We then do the same thing for calculating our offensive CR. This time we take the average damage per round, average across those 3 rounds, and we see what that CR is that matches that amount of damage. Then we look at the attack value for a monster. And if ours is 2 points higher or lower than the attack bonus we would expect for the CR, we're going to alter that initial CR calculation. If your monster uses saving throws, you would use saving throw DCs instead of attacks for this step. So now we've got our defensive CR, offensive CR, add them together, divide by 2, and round normally to determine what your CR really is. And that is the CR of your current monster. That's the 2014 process. Is it good? I think it's actually pretty reasonable still. It generally is going to average out things pretty well, and it weighs hit points and damage more heavily than the AC or the attack bonuses, and I think that's still worth doing. You could also just simply think of going up and down the table, and wherever is statistically you're going up and down the table, try to do so in an equally important category going up and down. That can generally work well too, but I like the 2014 process still for creating official monsters, or monsters that will reflect official guidelines. Does 2024 inside of Wizards headquarters follow this process? I don't know, and we don't know enough about that. But creating monsters this way will get you in a monster that is would be indistinguishable from something that you'll find in 2024 if you follow that process. What I will say is 2024, and this actually helps creators, 2024 monsters seem to at times vary significantly from the hit point range and even the damage per round for their CR, right? So I give the example of CR8 monsters in the monster manual, in the new 2024 monster manual, have 135 hit points on average. The CR8 assassin has 97 hit points. That's more like 5 or 6 CR, right? So it's 3 to 2 CRs off on its hit points. Does it make up for it with its other benefits? I think it's arguable. The Hydra has 184, which is higher than the average for CR10. This is a CR8 monster, right? CR8 Hydra should have 134 points, has 184. Why? Hard to say, right? But the point being that monsters aren't so tied to the table that you, following this process that I've given you, won't come up with a great monster. If you follow those steps and you do your best with this kind of calculation, you'll come up with a good monster. Some variance is expected, but if you're generally aiming off of that table, you're going to end up with something that's pretty good, and being a little lower or higher in a couple statistics will be fine. If you try to balance offense and defense CRs, you will generally be in a great place with the monster you create. And it's important to note that the CR is supposed to tell a varying picture, right? It would be boring if the game said all CR8 monsters have 135 hit points. And the truth is, if you think about it, the assassin taking a few good, strong blows and going down versus the Hydra having to take more hits, that makes sense, right? That tells a good story. So think about that and do be willing to say, I should be strong in hit points for my CR. So I'm going to go 2 or 3 higher on hit points but I'm going to go lower in something else, right? That makes some sense. Last thing I'll say is just that I really hope, we know that there is an SRD that's coming up in the future that will have the content that creators can use for the 2024 rules. Now, I would really love it if when the SRD comes out, it included guidelines on how to create monsters, right? I would love to have my blog rendered useless and this video rendered useless by the official guidelines coming out for how to create a monster. I think that those 2014 guidelines were really helpful to creators of all kinds of companies, from small to individuals to medium companies and larger. It helped everybody create better monsters. And that's the whole reason I put all this effort into making this blog and this video, is that I hope that you can use these guidelines, follow this process, and create awesome monsters. I also hope Wizards will see the benefit of it, that if people are creating better monsters for D&D 2024, the game itself is better and more fun, and more people will want to play it and therefore buy Wizards of the Coast products. So that's my request, Wizards. I hope you will create an official version of this and include it as part of the SRD, or at least in an upcoming book, but ideally in the SRD, so that everyone benefits, including Wizards. So I hope this video has been helpful. If it has, please do all the things you can, especially sharing the video, commenting on it, giving it that thumbs up. Visit my blog, share that with friends. And if you are so inclined and are able to do so financially, consider supporting me on Patreon, where you'll get the adventure tools I talked about that include these tables and more, that are all about analyzing monsters and helping you create cool things. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.